Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I stood before you a number of months ago and said to you for the first time that it was ever said to anybody in public by the Lyle Menendez team that Lyle Menendez had killed his parents and that he had done it out of fear and after a lifetime of abuse. I have no idea how that sounded to you then. I have no idea what the evidence in between has sounded like, and I have no idea how you view this case now. It is a very strange situation to have been in the same room with you for all of these months and really have no idea. What are the questions you have? What have we proven that you all agree on? What are the areas that concern you? I don't know. And so I'm going to cover the evidence as best I can. I'm going to remind you of what people said. I'm going to raise questions about some of the evidence. I'm going to suggest that some of it is particularly reliable, particularly compelling. I may be saying things to you that you already agree with. I may be saying things to you you haven't thought of. I may be saying things that you disagree with. As I say, there's no way to know. But the one thing that I'm sure that all of you experienced at the beginning was what in the world could have caused these two brothers to kill their parents. I said in the beginning that the only issue for you was going to be why. And although Mrs. Bozanich has indicated correctly, it is not up to the prosecution to prove motive, it is here to this degree. You need to decide what was going on in Eric and Lyle Menendez's mind that night before you can decide what kind of crime was committed. We're not talking to you about self-defense in its purest sense. You will not be given instructions on that situation. That is a situation in which someone kills in good faith, that is, they believe they're in fear, and they kill reasonably. That is not the issue here. The best that you can do in this case, from our perspective, is a manslaughter, because that is an unreasonable killing in good faith. And it is our suggestion to you that that is what has occurred here. And as to the type of manslaughter, I will get to that later. It is our position that Eric and Lyle Menendez on August 20th, 1989, for reasons which may not make sense to you given your life experiences, but made sense to them, believed their parents were going to kill them. When Mrs. Bozanich said that this is not a trial of the parents, that's true. But it is essential that you understand the world in which they lived. And it was a world exclusively controlled by their parents. It was a world created by their parents. And it is that world that you need to understand before you can evaluate whether small gestures and words here and there really could have made them believe that they were about to be killed. Mrs. Bozanich in the beginning stood before you as I did and told you why these killings occurred. She offered theories of greed and of hate and of perfect crime. And I think as time went on, you saw that greed didn't make sense for a young man such as Lyle Menendez, who was authorized to spend money with a $250,000 limit on the credit card. It didn't make sense for a young man who had always had all the money he needed and spent it freely and spent it generously. It didn't make sense for the young man whose parents were in the process of buying him a new condominium, whose mother was headed back to Princeton in early September to buy furniture, who was going to an expensive Ivy League school at his parents' expense, who was going to be playing on the tennis team, who had spent his summer traveling back and forth between Princeton and Los Angeles and a tennis camp in Florida. It didn't make sense. And what about hatred? What was the evidence that's been produced with regard to hatred? I think it would be hard to find two young men who, when you question the people who knew them, who had spoken as well of their parents as these boys had. There was no evidence of hatred. In fact, there's an abundance of evidence of love. And so the hatred theme was one that no longer the prosecution was reasonably going to rely on. The perfect crime theory seemed to have its only support in the testimony of Dr. Oziel, whom I will talk about a little bit later, but that is another theme that obviously made no sense. And so they come to you and say that two young men with apparently everything going for them, certainly in a materialistic sense, took shotguns and killed their parents because they wanted to be free from their control. Well, you saw Lyle Menendez on the stand for 9 days. You heard him talk about the fact that, Dad picked his college and his dad was going to buy this compound in Florida, and parents clearly were going to be involved in the selection of who he married. And I don't know what you saw. I didn't see any resentment there. What I heard was a young man who had been convinced that he was incapable of functioning on his own, that his only chance at a life with any degree of success was to have the constant support and guidance of his father. I don't think that there has been evidence that there is this resistance to control that would get two young men at the same point in time to take this incredible action. The evidence is not there. And that is what this case is about. It is about evidence. It is not about speculation. It is not about theory. It is not about showers that might have been taken or movie tickets that might have been bought beforehand. It's about what has been proven to you. And as Mr. Burt went through with you yesterday, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They made the charge. It is up to them to prove to you with evidence, not with slogans, not with character assassination, not with titles such as spoiled rich kid. That's not what this case is about. Because you're rich, you can't be afraid. Would money have really been an adequate trade-off for you to have lived the life that Lyle Menendez lived? I would suggest to you that we have all been sensitized to the idea that discrimination is an inappropriate response to situations, discrimination based on race or religion or economic status. And to decide this case because someone was born into a wealthy family by a different standard of justice than if he had been born into a poor family is to violate not only your oath, but the tradition of this country. I want to talk to you about some of the particular points that were raised by Mrs. Bozanich, and then I'm going to go through the evidence in a more general sense. One of the comments that she'd made was that it's understandable that the relatives would have rallied around the boys. Now, I've put on the chart for you, up on the board here for you, our family tree chart. And I think that one of the most remarkable things to me about this case has been the people who have come forward and testified. It is not a question of they killed a stranger, and so their aunts and their uncles and their cousins would have no affiliation to the people who were killed here. The witnesses who came in here cried for Lyle and Eric Menendez, and they cried for Kitty and Jose Menendez. Joan Vandermolen, Pat Anderson, Marta Cano, Peter Cano, Terry Baralt, Carlos Baralt, Marianne Cano, Diane and Kathy Vandermolen, Alan Anderson. This is a remarkable response by people who cared deeply about the people who died here. They didn't come in here unconflicted. They came in here with all of the baggage that everyone has about not speaking ill of the dead, about grief at their own tremendous losses. It was not easy for them, and I think that you saw the emotion that they demonstrated. So to say that it is expected that they would come forward. The only witness who testified for the prosecution was Brian Anderson. And the most negative thing he had to say was that the boys talked back, although he couldn't remember a single incident in which Lyle had talked back. And to suggest to you that because Lyle had bought a video camera, which he bought with his coach, and which Mrs. Menendez subsequently used, was somehow the reason that these killings took place. Mr. Anderson has his own agenda, which I will address later. But I think that that is a remarkable response by a family. And it speaks to a number of issues. It speaks to their love for Lyle and Eric Menendez. It speaks to their fundamental sense of decency and justice. And I think that one of the things you have to realize is that these people, particularly the people who were adults when Lyle and Eric were growing up, have come in and said to you, we saw things that troubled us. We saw things that were wrong, and we didn't protect them. That was a very difficult hurdle for them to overcome. It is very hard to come in and say, I saw treatment in a family which was abusive and offensive and damaging, and I didn't do anything. And yet they came in, and they told you about that. Mrs. Bozanich said, well, they sent their kids to live with them. I think it's very interesting that the kids who lived with them, Kathy Simonton, who is Joan and Arnold's daughter, was there for 2 months one summer and left early. At age 15, it was so oppressive that she couldn't stay and never went back. Diane stayed 2 summers, and the first summer she was treated very specially. Kitty was very good to her. She talked about how much she loved her Aunt Kitty. And by the second summer that she stayed, 2 years later, things were a little different. But she'd begun to think that maybe it was her. Maybe it was her fault. Maybe she wasn't really doing things well enough. And then she lived with them for 13 months. But in terms of the parents sending them, it's very interesting that it was Joan's 2 daughters who went. Joan, who lived in Arizona and never really spent time in the Menendez home when those children were growing up. The incidents she talked about were all incidents that happened after they were grown, and they didn't take place in the Menendez home. So she had no idea. Brian Anderson sent his son Alan. Now, Brian saw them periodically on vacations, but as you heard him testify, he couldn't even come within 3 years of his nephew's ages. He didn't even remember that Eric was alive in Hinsdale. He didn't seem to have a real intimate knowledge of how that family worked. Marta Cano said that she let her son Andy stay overnight occasionally when he got old enough, and she would give him instructions. She told you about the time he stayed there when he was 3 and required 17 stitches. I don't remember Terry and Carlos ever saying that their children stayed. And Faith Goldsmith, Kitty's oldest and closest friend, who loved her dearly and admired her energy and her brightness and her fearlessness, would never let her children stay there. So I think that in terms of people letting their children stay, you should view that comment with great caution. Mrs. Bozanich suggested to you that this was an act of vigilantism, that this was 2 children fed up with control, mad at being molested, took action. And that that's not appropriate, that they should have just gone to the police and Jose Menendez would have had a trial. Now, I have to confess, I have a hard time imagining Jose Menendez sitting in here as a defendant in a child molest case being cross-examined by Mrs. Bozanich or whatever. But, you know, maybe it would have happened. Maybe they would have prosecuted if the boys had gone to the police. But they didn't prosecute when Jill Smith reported that Dr. Oziel had raped her. And they didn't prosecute the forgery charge when he wrote a false letter for her. People are very careful about bringing charges against the rich and famous. And they should be. It's just that they should be equally careful about bringing charges against those who are neither rich nor famous. This is not about vigilantism, and this is not about paying people back. It doesn't make sense. Why then? Why both of them? Lyle's life actually was going better at this point in time than it ever had. His parents were buying him a new condominium. He was going back to Princeton. He was going to be able to play on the tennis team, which was a strong source of his identity. He hadn't been able to play in the spring because Jose Menendez had decided it was better if he sat out the year and could play the following year. He had a girlfriend. He was away, as far away as he was ever going to get, and as far away as he'd ever been in his life. Why in the world would he take action then? Mrs. Bazanich talked about statements to Detective Zoller about the camcorder, about Lyle buying the camcorder. And Lyle said something to the effect that, he'd see something the family needed, he'd buy it, and usually the family pay for it. And he said there were a lot of fights about it. I suppose there always had been. If you had a son at 18 who was sending roses to his girlfriend every Friday and buying her an emerald pendant and buying her a fur coat when she broke up with you, I suppose there would have been a lot of fights about money. But I also suppose that if it was ever a big enough issue, there are things like canceling credit cards, taking away the checkbook. They didn't seem to be of great enough importance to have engendered any response to the problem. So it's probably one of those things in a family, as all families have, that you fight about over and over again. And nobody ever changes, and it never gets resolved, and it's just one of the facts of the family. But it's not the cause for killing people. Mrs. Bazanich put up a chart that had a number of the witnesses on it, and I am going to talk about a lot of the same witnesses she spoke of. And as I'm sure will not surprise you, I saw some of them differently. And I would urge that you should see some of them differently than she suggested as well. She began by talking to you about the 911 call. You're going to have it. You can listen to it. You can read it. She claims that the emotion is false. You can decide that for yourself. No one can tell you that. That's an opinion you'll arrive at on your own. You saw Lyle Menendez testify here. She said he was acting. You can decide that for yourself as well. We had the testimony of 3 neighbors who heard the shots. And the reason we had 3 neighbors who heard the shots was to emphasize to you the fact that when you fire off shotguns at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, on a warm August night, in which people have their windows open, people are going to hear. And people did hear. And what they heard was pretty much the same thing. It was all around 10 o'clock. They all said that they heard a half a dozen, 7, 8, 10 shots. That's the range. They heard a slight pause in between, a second or two. They all said that their windows were open and it was easy to hear. And this speaks to the material that Dr. Burgess covered with you in terms of planning. You saw the videotape. These are big homes, but they are not far apart.
One of my favorite supplements is Cunol turmeric. Turmeric helps with healthy joints and inflammation support, and Cunol has the #1 doctor recommended form of turmeric. Cunol, the brand I trust.
You can clearly hear. And so that evidence is important just in terms of looking at if you are planning to kill someone, does it make any sense to have done it here in this way at this time? Deputy Van Horn testified, and I don't remember if Mrs. Bazanich mentioned him, but his testimony was that based on the evidence found at the scene, which was the wadding, that he could verify that there were 6 rounds of buckshot and 2 rounds of birdshot. Now, he looked for all the evidence he could find. There's no testimony about anybody picking up waddings. And so that is certainly a base number 8. The coroner talked about the number of shots or the number of wounds. He never talked about the number of shots. The wounds were important for several reasons. One, it is clear from his testimony that some of those wounds had to have been sustained while Kitty and Jose Menendez were standing, which is consistent with what Lyle Menendez told you. He walked into that room, illuminated only by the light of the flickering television set, and saw people moving, saw his father coming toward him. It is clear from the coroner's testimony that they were standing when this began and not sitting. In terms of the number of wounds, all that he could tell you was, or the number of shots, all he could tell you was the number of wounds, and that it was very possible that a number of the shots could have caused more than one wound. In terms of the shots in the French doors, one of them is very tight and one of them is spread out, and it could have easily have been that the one that was spread out passed through something else first. And there are a number of pass-through wounds in both Kitty and Jose Menendez. That is, the pellets went in and came out and went somewhere else. And if your hand is over your eye and the pellets go in and come out, you don't have a clear space underneath. You have pellet wounds. So I think you should take into account the coroner's testimony just with regard to the fact that it does not establish 14 shots. It clearly can be reconciled with far fewer shots. And that becomes important with regard to the reload issue. And I will address that later. Having decided that Dr. Oziel was not someone whose credibility they wanted to rely on or to ask you to rely on, prosecution has suggested to you that the most important witnesses are Perry Berman and Amanda Greer. Perry Berman told us, although a prosecution witness, our first facts about this family. He talked about Jose doing the most outrageous thing he had ever seen done on a tennis court by a parent. He talked about Jose running the family like a company. He also told you about the family meeting, which was centered around the fact that Lyle had taken the blame for damage to a pool table that someone else did. Now, it's been suggested to you that part of the reason that these killings took place was because the parents were upset because Lyle was on disciplinary probation and he was on academic probation. He was on disciplinary probation for taking responsibility for damage to a pool table, which Mr. Menendez had to pay for. I'm sure he wasn't happy about paying for it, but I doubt that this was something of such great moment that he would have changed his entire approach to his children or his relationship with them. In terms of disciplinary probation, I don't think that anybody in that family expected Lyle Menendez to do anything except graduate. Clearly, the discussion had been held that there wasn't going to be any graduate school, and grades were not the issue. He told us about the fact that he knew that the parents had ended the relationship with Christy, the girlfriend that Lyle had had. But more importantly, he talked about the sequence of events on Sunday. And I'd like you to think of these events in terms of the circumstantial evidence instruction. The facts are pretty much agreed upon. What those facts mean is for you to decide. And if there is an interpretation of those facts that points to guilt and an equally reasonable interpretation that points to innocence, you must give the benefit to the defendant. You must give Lyle Menendez the benefit of the doubt and adopt that interpretation, which points to innocence rather than guilt. And the facts are these. Perry Berman gets a call from Lyle Menendez on his machine earlier that day. He calls back and talks to Mr. Menendez and is told that Lyle is out. Not that he can't go out that night, but that he is out shopping at the Beverly Center then. And Lyle Menendez calls him back. And on top of everything else that has happened, he's now being told that his father told Barry Berman he was out when he was at home. And that has meaning to him. But what he does is he makes plans with Perry Berman for that night. And the issue is, did he make social plans or was he setting up an alibi? Those are the two interpretations. Well, I would suggest to you that I've always thought of an alibi as the person who says he couldn't have been there, he was with me at the time. So they make a date for 9:30. Mr. and Mrs. Menendez are not killed until 10 o'clock. Lyle Menendez doesn't get to the Santa Monica Civic until 11:07, according to the phone call. How is that an alibi? It seems to me it is just the opposite. Because you had plans to be somewhere and you didn't show up. You were obviously somewhere else, doing something else. It seems to me that if I am planning to kill someone, I want someone who can say, yeah, he was with me. Not, no, he was supposed to be here at 9:30 and didn't show up and didn't call me till a little bit after 11. Leaves a lot of time unaccounted for. So you will have to decide whether this evidence points inevitably to an alibi or equally to an alibi in social plans or to social plans. I obviously am suggesting the position that it points to social plans. If you find that it is even equally reasonable that it points to an alibi, then again, you must adopt that version of the events which points to innocence. He says that when he called at 11:07, Lyle sounded anxious and jumpy. He'd seemed normal during the day. Now, since when he's talking to Perry Berman, he is not trying to convince Perry Berman of his grief over his parents, since he's obviously not told them that they are dead. Why would he sound anxious and jumpy? Why would he fabricate this emotion at this time? It makes no sense. I suggest to you that this emotion, as the other emotions here, were genuine. Mrs. Bazanich asked why Jose Menendez would have talked to Perry Berman about business plans if he was planning to kill his sons. I have two responses to that. One is, I would hardly expect Jose Menendez to say, sorry, Perry, I can't talk to you right now. I'm sort of busy planning to kill my sons. Somehow that doesn't seem like what would happen. And the other point, and I think this is even more important, is we're talking about what Lyle Menendez knew and thought and felt on Sunday, August 20th. He didn't know anything about Jose Menendez's plans to talk to Perry Berman in the future about his business dealings. We are not asking you to say they acted reasonably. That is not the test here. A manslaughter is an unreasonable killing. By definition, it is one that is conducted in good faith, on actual belief. And that is a distinction that I think you need to keep in mind. The people brought you Robert Anderson, I guess, to talk about what a happy family it was and how things were really going so well. And I've put up on the board some testimony of Robert Anderson. And as I'm sure you know, all of the testimony is taken down, and this is what it looks like when it's all printed up, only it's on white paper. But he talks about what Lyle and Eric Menendez are doing that night. And he says, and they, upon leaving Marina Del Rey, we actually took a wave over the front of the boat that soaked them. And we were on top of the flybridge, of course, and didn't get wet, and yet we were still cold. And I believe they were wearing shorts. And we couldn't understand why they were standing up there freezing. And then later, he's asked to describe their behavior. He says they appeared to be cold and shivering. And they were so very close to each other, right below us, sitting on the bridge of the boat. So they were in a position where you could observe them at all times. I was right on top of them, yes. Okay. And their father was at the opposite end of the boat? Yes, he stayed to the rear of the boat. What did you observe about the interaction of this family? Did they seem to be happy and getting along, or how did they appear to you? Well, like I said, they were very actually apart during the trip. The sons were up front, and Jose was either in the stern of the boat or down below with Kitty. And there wasn't very much interaction going on, verbal interaction going on. Now, I can't think of stronger evidence of their state of mind the night before. Mrs. Bazanich argues it's unreasonable for them to have been frightened on the boat. Maybe it was unreasonable, but was it real? What other state of mind does this behavior comport with? Now, the prosecution may suggest, well, they're up there because they're planning to commit this crime. Well, they've had days of being together. They don't need to sit up front in a freezing boat, drenched, to talk about killing their parents. They were up there because they were afraid. And this is a prosecution witness. This is not someone who visited them at the jail or is related to them, so would lie for them. The captain of the boat who never saw them before and never saw them again. When you evaluate this behavior, if there are two reasonable interpretations of it, and one is to the benefit of the defense, you must by law adopt that view. The other star witness is Amanda Adams Greer. Now, I think the important thing about Amanda Greer, she said that she sold the guns. Well, obviously, Lyle and Eric Menendez admitted to that. Mrs. Bazanich made the point that they only admitted to things that could be proven. Well, as I heard Wesley Grouse, who was the handwriting expert, testify, the most he could say was that the handwriting was probably Eric's. So I'm not sure how they were going to prove that Lyle was involved in the buying of the guns, other than him admitting it to you. She couldn't identify him. She didn't remember him being there. His handwriting wasn't on the forms. And yet he told you he was there. And he told you that he went not to one gun store, but he went to 4. Now, I haven't quite figured out how this is somehow a lie that benefits the defendant, to go to 4 gun stores to buy stronger ammunition. It just happens to be what happened. And Lyle Menendez lied to a lot of people about a lot of things before he got to this courtroom, but he didn't lie to you here. Mrs. Greer says that she remembers that she thinks 2 people came in and it was really a fast transaction. She didn't really explain anything. She didn't really show them how to use the guns, which obviously is contrary to what both Lyle and Eric remember. And in evaluating Amanda Adams Greer, since her only importance truly is whether she explained how to work the guns or not, I guess that's the only disputed testimony. I think it's important to look back at what she said here. And the page that we pulled out here, 8167, refers to a him, which is Detective Zoller. March 14th, 1990, you told him you did not remember the sale at all, right? You had no recollection of who bought the guns, male or female, 1 or 2, what time of day. It was nothing. Not at the top of my mind, no. Okay. And you said you didn't remember the driver's license specifically that was used for the sale. Meaning what? Well, he asked you if you remembered the license you were shown. Do you remember telling him you didn't? I don't remember. Yeah, I remember telling him. I didn't recall. Okay. And do you recall Detective Zoller asking you if the purchaser who filled out the form resembled the picture on the driver's license? Yes, I do remember him asking. And do you remember telling him that you didn't remember if he did or not, but you assumed he did? Right, correct. And do you recall that Detective Zoller showed you what are called photo lineup cards? Correct. And that card has the pictures of 6 people on each card? Correct. And he showed you two different cards? Yes. And you selected a number of a person you said looked familiar to you, but did not in reference to the sale because you didn't remember the sale. Is that correct? Correct. Last August 1992, you testified before the grand jury. Correct? Correct. And isn't it true that you testified under oath before the grand jury that you didn't recall whether the individual to whom you sold the guns was alone or with somebody? Correct. And you did not, when you testified before the grand jury, give any specifics of this transaction at all. Nothing about the time of day, nothing about the person being alone at the counter, nothing. Correct? She says correct. So I bring that to your attention merely in evaluating anything Mrs. Greer says about who was there, how long they were there, or what they did. I think that you really got the sense from watching her testify that she was looking at these forms and saying, I always ask for a driver's license. I always ask for the address. I must have done it then. But she clearly has absolutely no independent recollection of this sale. She didn't in March of 90, and she didn't in June of 92, and she doesn't now. So in terms of what could be proven, and what Lyle Menendez has admitted suggests to you that he has admitted something that the prosecution could not have proven.
Skating for over 45 years has taken a toll on my body. I take Cunol turmeric because it helps with healthy joints and inflammation support. Why Cunol? It has superior absorption compared to regular turmeric. Cunol, the brand I trust.
I want to address at this time the what Mrs. Bazanich likes to call the bombshell, the big five. And I'd like to talk to you about that. Now, Lyle Menendez testified that he went to a gun store a block and a half away from the freeway. And we know from testimony that the big five is a mile and a half away. And Eric Menendez testified that Lyle didn't remember the name of the store. He didn't live out here, that he had told him was the big five. And you all may remember Eric Menendez talking about being with his mother when she bought her rifle. And he kept telling you it was Sport Mart, in spite of the fact that Ms. Abramson kept showing him the receipt that showed it was Best Products. And so there are a couple of explanations for the big five. One of them is that they made it up. It's a total lie. They never went there. And then the question is, why would they lie about that? Why would they have a total of 4 gun stores they went? How does that help the case? Well, Mrs. Bazanich's theory is that they went there and found out they had to fill out forms and show ID, so they went to San Diego. And they didn't find out about the waiting period, which is why what they said they had found out there. Now, there's a couple problems with it. Number one, they both talked about a gun store very close to the freeway, which this isn't. So it's possible they have the wrong gun store. Number two, I don't find it hard to believe that you could go into a gun store and look at the counter of guns that are displayed there, which you'll see in the photographs, and assume some of them are real and assume some of them are not. The guns behind the counter are both real and mixed. And it's very interesting that Lyle Menendez at one point in talking about his mother's rifles calls them pellet guns, and they're real. We know they're real. But if this is a planned killing, and if things happened as Mrs. Bazanich suggests, that what they found out there was that you needed ID and needed to fill out forms, why not use the ID that Eric Menendez had in the name of Richard Stevens? It had his photo, so there wouldn't have been a problem. It had a fake name, and it had a fake address. No one in the world would have gone looking for Richard Stevens, as opposed to Donovan Goudreau, who was known to all of Lyle's friends and family. So when you look at how significant this is, I think you have to ask yourself, in light of all the things they could have lied about, they could have told you that the threats right before they killed their parents were far stronger. Lyle Menendez could have denied to you the conversation with Jamie Pisarcik. It would have been his word against hers, and I suggest we would have had a fighting chance in that battle. They could have lied to you about the reload. He could have lied to you about the reload, because there is no way to prove that there were 14 shots. There weren't, I don't think. I don't think there's any evidence to support that. We know there's at least 8, and you've got guns that fully loaded hold 12. And if you had even a reasonable doubt that it was less than 12, there never needed to be a reload. And the neighbors don't even hear a period of time, which is a great enough pause to account for a reload. And even if there was a reload, they could have both denied it, and you would have never known who did it. Lyle Menendez came in and said, yes, I had that conversation with Jamie Pisarcik. Yes, I reloaded. And Lyle Menendez came in and said, I did the 2 close shots. The 2 shots which are the worst shots in this case. And as to his dad, he said, I don't really remember, but I must have. He could have said, it wasn't me. And would you have known? Would you have known whether it was him or his brother? So of all the lies that could have been told, I would say that getting Diane Vandermolen to say that she walked in on him when he was molested would have done us a lot more good than I went to the Big 5 and found out about the waiting period. So in judging credibility here, I think that you need to look at what the opportunities to lie were, and that he didn't do it. And they weren't things that could have been proven. Donovan Goudreau testified here, and I think that there were a number of interesting things that came out of his testimony besides the fact that it was his license and he didn't buy the guns in San Diego. I think he gave you probably your first glimpse of the neediness of Lyle Menendez, of how hungry for love and comfort and closeness he was, of how dependent he became. Here was someone that he was with every day, that he told about his father and the programming, and attempted to train Donovan to be good enough so that he could keep him as a friend, and practiced with him before Donovan Goudreau met his parents, and was sad because they both knew that Donovan had not passed the test. He talked about Lyle's spending before, and he's one of many people who talked about his generosity. He was loaning money and buying presents for people. He also saw, in the spring of '89, Lyle Menendez taken by his father into the basement of Terry Baralt's house for 3 hours for another one of the talks. He told us, most importantly of all, I think, about Lyle's reaction the day that Donovan was thrown out of that room. Thrown out of that room because Jose demanded it, and because Glenn Stevens was pushing it, and Hayden Rogers. Lyle didn't want to get rid of Donovan. He knew he'd lied to him. He knew he was a fraud. He wasn't going to Princeton. Other people were talking about him stealing money, and Lyle didn't care. That was his friend. And everyone who saw that incident saw his sadness and saw his pain. And to think that as soon as Donovan drives off, he does the victory dance described by Glenn Stevens of, oh, look at, I've got his credit or his bank card, I've got his driver's license, isn't this great, is ludicrous. That is not who Lyle Menendez is, and it is not who he demonstrated himself to be at that time. He also told you about a conversation at a Chinese restaurant. And he's gone back and forth on this, and you will have the tape of his interview with Bob Rand, one of the reporters who was covering this case when he was writing a book. You'll hear Donovan Goudreau's statements about that conversation. He then says, well, I'm really not sure. Maybe somebody told me that. But listen to the tape and judge for yourself. But at a minimum, he told us that when he sat there with Lyle Menendez at dinner one night and told him of his own molestation, that Lyle got tears in his eyes and reacted in such a way that he believed it had happened to Lyle also. Lyle said that he said something to him about it having happened to himself and his brother to comfort Donovan, because he didn't want Donovan to feel strange or humiliated. He wanted to let him know it was okay. I think that is a very reasonable context. It is almost the only context in which I can see Lyle Menendez voluntarily talking about what happened to him as a child. Not to get it off his chest, but to comfort a friend to whom he was extremely close. Glenn Stevens. Now, I don't know. You've heard so many witnesses. You've seen so many people. I don't know how many of these people stand out in your mind. But I would suggest to you that Glenn Stevens is probably one of the people who stands out most in my mind. Glenn Stevens, who told us and told Lyle what a close, dear friend he was, particularly in that critical period after the memorial service, talking about early September. And all of the time that Glenn Stevens is telling Lyle how close he is and letting Lyle pay plane tickets and pay for his apartment and pay for his car and wear his Rolex watch, which he subsequently sold. The Volvo, I think, got in an accident. He kept the money from that, from when it was totaled. He was giving Glenn Stevens a college sophomore without a bit of experience in restaurant management, $50,000 a year to run the restaurant. And all the while, he was reporting regularly to the police. He and Detective Zoller were chatting regularly, and he was passing along negative information on the promise that Lyle would never know, because, of course, he sort of liked this lifestyle. He liked being flown on these airplanes and staying in these hotels. And he started out by telling you that Lyle never bought anything for him, wouldn't have accepted it, wouldn't think of it. And then, well, there was that belt even before the Menendez parents died. And I think I said it was $250, and he corrected me that it was only $225, something like that. And I think one of the biggest betrayals of all was he did concede that Lyle bought this dog, which they named Muncie, because they were both from Muncie, and they shared this dog, which Lyle, as this penniless student, paid $185 for. He admitted here that he lied to Lyle regularly. He lied to the press. He talked to the press 15 to 20 times. He discussed a book deal. He lied on television on the primetime interview. And I think the word he liked to use was embellished his resume. But he explained that that was okay because they were taught to do that at Princeton. And so it really wasn't anything wrong to say that you supervised 20 employees instead of 5, or to claim that you were the valedictorian when you weren't, or to say that you won the Yale Book Award when you didn't. He lied to Princeton about why he left to run the restaurant. He didn't say, I'm leaving to run the restaurant, I need a leave of absence. He said he had psychological needs. When I asked about the psychological needs, he just said, well, he was depressed and he was taking medication. And then we come to the theft of the money from the restaurant. And the way that occurred, I think, is probably most significant of all. Prior to a break, I asked him if he knew a particular man, whose name I have to confess escapes me at this point in time, who was the accountant for the restaurant, who did the audit of the restaurant. We took a break, and when we resumed, he had clearly talked to Mrs. Bazanich over the break, and she said, is it true? And you'll have to go back, because I have to confess, I don't have the details on this. She said something to the effect, is it true that on occasion you took some money out of the cash register? You took as much as $50 or something. He said it was more like $500. I asked him then, isn't it true that the receipts in the restaurant went from $1,800 a day to $500 a day after Lyle was arrested? And he said, well, I don't think I took that much. I'm not sure that you want to base a verdict, which you will have to live with for the rest of your life, as will all of us, on someone of the character and quality of Glenn Stevens, who came in and said that Lyle said statements that no one else seemed to have heard, waited all this time to be in this position, that type of thing. He saw Lyle spend money, and he did, and there is absolutely no issue about that. Lyle spent all the money he had access to before they died, and he spent all the money he had access to after they died. He had access to a lot more money after they died. And he seemed to have gone through all of it in about 6 months. He bought 3 Rolexes, none of them are around anymore. He bought a car, it's not around anymore. He bought a restaurant, which went back to the owners. He made offers on 2 condominiums, which he never even closed. The only condominium that closed was the one his parents were buying for him. And the first of the spending people was Mary Ellen Mahar, the Rolex lady. She talks about several interesting things. She talks about the fact that he was using a credit card which he was authorized to use with a $250,000 limit. She said he had an out-of-state license, which is consistent with the Department of Motor Vehicle records that we had showed you, that he didn't have a California license. She said that right there in the store in front of everybody, he picks up the phone and calls Carlos and talks to him about buying the watches and about wearing them. And this is the first in a long line of situations where I think it becomes very apparent that he was not a person who didn't want control and guidance. He, in fact, did. He asked advice of total strangers. Richard Wenkowski, who was the bodyguard, had known him 3 or 4 days. And he was asking him what socks to buy, what do you think about the car, how's this suit? Didn't make a decision, didn't buy anything without asking his advice, and thanked him for his fatherly advice. But I will do Mr. Wenkowski next. But let me just finish with Miss Mahar. She also talked about their demeanor. He said that the boys were serious, subdued, and under stress. It was not a party, and they were not jovial. And there was no reason for them to think that this is somebody who was ever going to be coming in and testifying about their behavior. It is just how they were acting. Mrs. Bazanich talked about shopping as therapy. And I think that's a very interesting concept. And it's one that's widely held, is that people, I think the old adage of if you're depressed, go buy a new hat, which doesn't really work these days since people don't wear hats. But I think that there is this rather commonly known phenomena of people shopping to deal with unhappiness or depression or grief. And Mrs. Bazanich suggests to you that this is beyond the pale, that this type of shopping can't have anything to do with grief. Now, the people have the same access to experts that we do. And if she really thought that Dr. Conti's discussion of grief reactions and spending being consistent was incorrect, she could have brought an expert in to tell you. Richard Wenkowski is the bodyguard, and he talks about Lyle's spending, and he talks about Lyle having the bodyguards and being afraid, and the limo driver telling him that yes, in fact, they were being followed. And he told you that Lyle said he looked at him as a father figure and sincerely thanked him for his help. And then at the end of his testimony, he was asked by Mr. Bird about his relationship with the prosecution. And it picks up mid-sentence. And he's talking about his Detective Zoller. Showed around the town a bit is what precedes it. Yes, he showed us his police department. And did you do anything with him after hours? I believe we had a drink or two, yes. And you and Glenn Stevens and Detective Zoller had a drink or two? I don't know if Glenn was with us or not. He must have been. Yeah, he must have been. And did Detective Zoller take you and Glenn Stevens to a topless bar here in Los Angeles? And do you remember Mr. Wenskowski looking at you and smiling in a very charming way and saying, "I don't remember that, sir. I would remember that." Got a big laugh. You would have remembered that, and you don't remember that, but you remember going out with him and Glenn Stevens for drinks. Yes, sir. And then Glenn Stevens came in and told you that they did go to the topless bar, and Detective Zoller told you the other day that he did take them to the topless bar. So this man looked you right in the eye, and with all the warmth and charm he could muster, said, "I don't remember that, sir. I would remember that." I'd like you to keep that in mind as you evaluate anything Mr. Wenskowski had to say. Howard Witkin told you about erasing the computer. And Mrs. Bizanich chose to emphasize to you that he said that being around Lyle Menendez or being in that house or the combination of the two made his spine creep. Is she asking you to find Lyle Menendez guilty of murder because the computer repairman said he made his spine creep? Perhaps it speaks more to Mr. Witkin and decisions he reaches based on short contact with people. It's a rather strange bit of testimony to have elicited, and even stranger to rely on. I would hope that you would demand better evidence than that to make a decision of this importance. But when we're talking about the will and the computer, I want you to think about the other testimony here. Carlos Baralt, who Mrs. Bizanich rates on the good side of the credibility scale, one of the most believable of the relatives, according to her, said when they were in California, they knew two things, and they discussed two things, and he discussed them, and other family members discussed them in front of Lyle Menendez, and that is, one, there was no information in those files. Mr. Witkin said that it looked like it was 59 bytes or something like that. I'm one of those dinosaurs who knows nothing about computers, I have to confess, but everyone assures me that that is virtually no information at all. That they knew in California. And the other thing that Lyle Menendez knew in California was that a will on a computer could not be valid. It wasn't witnessed, it wasn't signed, it couldn't be valid. These are the things that Carlos Baralt told you he talked to Lyle Menendez about in California in general discussions with everybody else. Now, if Lyle Menendez was so worried about what was in that computer, why didn't he arrange then and there to have something done about it? He knew that there were plans for his cousin Eileen to send somebody out or get somebody local so it wouldn't cost as much money or whatever to look in there and see what was in there. He didn't do a thing about it. He didn't say to Eileen, "Don't do that, I'll take care of it." He didn't come out early to prohibit Eileen from looking in the computer. He trusted Eileen. It was just when there was this family flap about now Carlos Menendez is sending somebody and not telling Carlos Baralt and not telling Lyle and what's going on. This is a young man who is incredibly guilty feeling at this time. He is incredibly paranoid. He's concerned about the mafia. He's concerned about the mob. He's nervous about everything. And he's nervous about Carlos Menendez. And so he flies out, says, "Tell me what's in there, erase it, and put it back together again so nobody will know." Which is exactly what he told you he did here. And that's exactly what he had Mr. Witkin do. We are again in a situation where there are two possible interpretations of a situation. One is that he came out and erased the will because he wanted, now the old will had been found and he was going to inherit and he didn't want to lose it because of a new will. And so that's why he did it. Now, I don't think that that is very reasonable in view of the fact that he had all of the information he had in California. But assuming you see it as reasonable, then the question is, do you see the other explanation as equally reasonable? And again, the instruction is if there are two reasonable interpretations, you must always pick the one that is to the benefit of the defense. I think that of the two, I mean, obviously I have a perspective on what's reasonable and unreasonable, but I would suggest to you that even if you get to the point of suggesting that it's reasonable, then you have to apply the circumstantial evidence instruction. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on Dr. Oziel because a great deal of time has been spent on him already, and you were all here for it. But I do want to point out just a few particular facts. And one is Dr. Oziel had an agenda. He was hanging around the memorial service all day long, and the time in the hotel beforehand, billed them for 3 days of therapy, I believe. He participated in discussions about the estate and the money. He introduced Carlos Barral to a probate attorney who they actually went and met with. He, in his time with Eric and Lyle Menendez in October and November, discussed the estate with them, showed them lots of business cards. We know he has a history of patient business connection crossovers. And we have the tape in which he's saying to Judalon Smith after the boys are arrested, remember, there's $14 million at stake here. That seems an odd statement for someone who is merely being someone's therapist and has no interest in their financial well-being. I will talk when I get to a discussion of Lyle Menendez's testimony a little bit more about Dr. Oziel, but I'd like you to keep in mind who he is, what his credibility is. There's also that bizarre tape in which he tells Judalon to disguise her voice, pretend to be Eric Menendez, and threaten his wife. Both of those positions seem to be a bit at odds with a healthy therapeutic relationship. That was pretty much the prosecution case. That's what you had before we began. And we began by bringing you Dr. John Briere, who at least is not subject to the criticism of being from out of state, which somehow is a bad thing, I guess. But Dr. Briere told you certain things about family dynamics. Now, Mrs. Bozanich has taken the position that nothing any of the experts said had any merit or any value. And you all heard them, and you're going to make that decision yourself. I would suggest to you that if what they had said was incorrect, they have the same access to experts that we have. They could have had someone watch all of the testimony in this trial. It was all taped. They could have had someone sit in the courtroom, watch Lyle Menendez, watch the experts testify. They could have read the transcripts, and they could have come in and said to you, this is crazy. This isn't what the research shows. This isn't how it works. This isn't how people react. And yet there was not a single expert who came in and said, they're wrong about this. And even in her argument, Mrs. Bozanich just says psychobabble and doesn't say, this is what they said that really didn't make sense, or this theory is wrong. I know. I've produced evidence. I've shown you the study. I've brought you the experts to explain it to you. Dr. Briere talked to us about what happens in violent families. He told us that people who are badly treated in childhood are more likely to inflict or endure or tolerate violence in adult families. He told us that males are more reluctant to report sex abuse. He talked about some of the short-term effects of sexual abuse, which include bedwetting, sexual aggressiveness at an early age, anxiety, and depression. We've heard lots of testimony about Lyle Menendez wetting his bed until he was 14. We know what he has told us about what he did to his brother. We know what Diane Vandermolen has told us about his approaches to her when he was quite young. You can look at medical records that have been introduced which talk about in the first grade the fact that he grinds his teeth. And in his 20s, when he goes in for a doctor to look at a rotator cuff injury, and he's checking off symptoms of headaches, nausea, whatever it is, everything, he checks off nervousness. What are the long-term effects of abuse? hypervigilance, fear, panic, and depression. And he described hypervigilance as scanning the environment, looking for danger, afraid something will happen to them right now. It is a reaction to stress. He also told us that kids who are around a parent who is being battered can have some of the same symptoms as children who are battered themselves. They look terrorized. How do people cope in these situations? They normalize them. They say, this must be the way it is, or it must be my fault. And he talked about revealing trauma and told you that first, people must learn to trust. And that can't be done quickly, because one of the things that happens to abused people is they learn not to trust. Now, in this family, there was an affirmative goal on the part of Jose Menendez to teach his children not to trust anyone, not even him, interestingly enough. And we have the two stories of Lyle being pushed in the swing higher and higher and higher and being terrified, and his father saying, you know, if you're going to depend on somebody to push you, then you're going to be at their mercy, basically. And Carlos Baralt told the story of Jose saying to Eric, his young son, jump. And he jumped and he caught him. Jump. And he jumped and he caught him. Jump. And he stepped aside. And when he hit the ground, he said, that will teach you never to trust anyone, not even your father. This is a home in which trust would have been destroyed without any affirmative program. But he did seem to have that as a goal for whatever reason. Dr. Briere also talked to you about two terms which I think are important, which is chronic versus acute. You can have one terrifying experience which will stay with you for life. I suspect that if you are raped in an underground parking structure, you will never enter an underground parking structure again in your life without re-experiencing that fear. That is acute. And it stays with you for a long, long time, maybe forever. The other is chronic, and that is smaller things happen, but they happen to you over and over again. Small things happen and you say, well, I guess that was my fault. I guess he was in a bad mood. I guess 4th of July is never a good day for him. And then time goes on and you start to say, well, okay, well, maybe it's going to be okay again. Well, if it is not okay on a regular basis, then you end up with the same level of terror because you spend your life saying, when's it going to happen again? And one of the most damaging aspects of the punishment system in this family was its unpredictability. Remember Alan Anderson talking about hearing the snapping of the belt? And Jose would come home and take his belt off and put it on the table. And you didn't know who was going to get beaten. And you didn't know why. You just knew someone was. That is terrifying. Kathy Simonton said to us, the best thing you could be in that family was invisible. And she would hide in her room because you didn't know what the rules were. If someone says, if you eat with your hands, you're going to your room. And you eat with your hands, you go to your room, you know what happened. But if nobody ever tells you what the rules are, and the rules are always changing, and what's okay one day is not okay the next, then you spend your life in fear that you're going to cross that unseen and unseeable line. And that was the lifetime experience of Lyle Menendez. And we're not talking about something that, although we brought in experts for you, we're not talking about experiences that are beyond your ability to relate to from your own life. Have you ever seen a small child where somebody raises their hand to scratch their head or something and they flinch? Now, that child may have been hit. And that's why any sudden movement they're going to react to. They react in a protective fashion. And when we talk about cues, have any of you said, you know, there's an important discussion to be had with your spouse or your parent or your child or your boss or your social friends, and you look at the person's face that day and say, this is not a good day for it. You know, there's a good time and there's a bad time. There's a good mood and a bad time. We all read cues. That's how we get through life. And for the abused child, reading those cues is even more critical because the consequences of a mistake are so severe. And if you're going to err, you're going to err on the side of caution because you do not want to create that reaction. It became important in explaining to you how these children could have feared their parents to tell you who their parents were. And one of the things that I did was to go through the testimony and pull out the descriptions that were given by witnesses. Now, with very few exceptions, the witnesses who testified in this court liked or loved Kitty and Jose Menendez. One or two of them came in and said, I hate him. I think Roger Smith said, I don't think he said I hate him. He said I really didn't like him. It was clear he really didn't like him. And so he said a lot of very negative things about him. But we also had his sisters, his brother-in-law, his friends, people who knew him. We had teachers who had no reason to be on one side or the other of this issue. We had coaches. And I'd like to go through, and some of them said good things too, and they're not on that list. I think that people talked about Jose being bright and successful and motivated and charming and handsome and compelling. And I've no doubt he was all those things. But he was also belligerent, manipulative, powerful, rude, nasty, never satisfied, had a cut you to shreds tone of voice, was aggressive, frightening, intimidating, cruel, harshest person ever met. He had to win. He was overbearing, confrontational, demeaning, abusive, sadistic, sarcastic, controlling, fake, secretive, demanding, cold, competitive, arrogant, angry, and belittling. I've tried not to duplicate. I don't think I have them on there twice, but those were, and that's not all of it. How many people do you know who would fit that description? And would you let them raise your child? And Kitty Menendez, who is very interesting, she was not discussed at all in the prosecution argument. And Kitty Menendez, in some ways, is just seen as a part of Jose Menendez. He gave her the instructions, she wrote the list, and she went to the tennis coach and enforced it and sat there. And sat there and watched her small children play tennis for 6 hours at a time in grueling heat. And sat there and watched him hit them and belittle them and take them down into the room and never go in there. And so it is understandable that she is seen as a part of him. And yet there were people who knew her and saw her as a separate person. And I think it's important to look at that also. And the positive things, they said she was bright and bubbly and a lot of fun and fearless and very competent. And she was strong. Everyone talks about her strength. She was physically strong and she had a strong personality. I think at one point, Mr. Coriano was trying to make the point that she was 5'2" or something like that. I think her driver's license says she's 5'4" or 5'5". Nobody who has been in this courtroom for the number of months you have been in is going to say that being small means you can't be aggressive. Kitty Menendez is described as hostile, strong, frustrated, sarcastic, angry at life, overbearing, unprotective, confrontational, intimidating, needy, pathetic, suspicious, disorganized, bizarre, jealous, secretive, physically assaulted, compulsive, obsessed, depressed, dishonest, reckless, unpleasant, controlling, most competitive person ever met, winning was everything, cheat to win, rages, unpredictable, frightening, fearless, messy appearance, depressed, and sad. And the messy appearance, which I think Mrs. Bazanich took issue with someone talking about how she looked and commenting she needed a bleach job or something like that. The messy appearance, how she looked, is important only in this regard. People who are mentally ill do not take good care of themselves. Again, this was not the list of one angry person. These were the descriptions by her relatives, by her best friends, by teachers who saw her, by coaches. Do you know anybody who would meet that description? And would you ever trust your child to them? Do you want to
All right, we'll
take a break now?
recess at this point, and we'll resume at 5 minutes to the hour. Ladies and gentlemen, don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any opinions about the case. We'll resume at 5 minutes to the hour. The argument, you may proceed.
Thank you. I want to go through you now, as briefly as I can, the witnesses who've testified for the defense here, and highlight for you some of the things they told you about the family in which Lyle Menendez was raised. Now, it is impossible, I think, for anyone to experience someone else's pain. We say things like, I understand how you feel, I know what it must have been like, but the truth of the matter is, you can't ever really feel what it's like. I would merely ask that as you listen to these events and you think about the mood in this household, you picture what it would be like to be there every day of your life and to have no other world. And on top of it, to be a small child. If you're an adult, and I think that the experts talked about this with regard to the battered woman as opposed to the battered child. If you are an adult, you knew another world, and hopefully a better one, before the world in which you find yourself. You have access to other people and to an outside world. But if you are a small child, your world is defined by the people you interact with. And for Lyle Menendez, the people he interacted with were his mother, his father, and his brother. And his brother was treated as someone not worthy of respect, much younger than him, and not particularly strong. No source of comfort, no sense of reality for him or another reality. Yet his mother and his father, and they did everything in the world to ensure that no one else would have any impact on him, any control over him, or any access to him. Coaches came and went. They were hired and fired by the parents. I never heard any description of a discussion with Lyle Menendez. How do you feel about Mr. Wadlington? Do you mind if we replace him? What about Mr. Curtin? Do you like him better? How about Brad Werner? They were hired by the Menendez parents, and they were fired by him. And there was never a chance for any bonding, never a chance for any closeness, because they could be gone tomorrow. You wouldn't know why. You wouldn't be asked, and you certainly had no part in the decision making. And so the world was the world created by Jose and Kitty Menendez. Our first glimpse into that world was Alan Anderson, who talked about being there 2 summers in 75 and 77. He is 6 years older than Lyle. So the events that he's talking about that are happening to him at 15 are happening to Lyle at 9, which was the oldest Lyle was during the time that Alan Anderson ever stayed with him. Alan talked about hearing but not seeing the fights between Kitty and Jose. He would hear her cry, and he would see her bruises in the morning. He talked about dinners as Jeopardy dinners. You were quizzed And if you didn't know the answer, you got up in the middle of dinner and you looked it up. And if you didn't know the answer, you were belittled and you were humiliated. And there was tremendous tension. Can you imagine knowing every night you're going to face that? All of us have experiences in our life where we have to do something difficult, where we have to prepare for a test, or have to prepare for a difficult assignment at work, or have to do something that is emotionally draining and intellectually demanding. And yet it happened every single night. And the price of failure was the highest price a child can pay. And that is the loss of affection, the loss of love, the loss of approval. More than anything in the world, Lyle Menendez wanted then, did for all of their lives, and does still today, want his parents to love him. And every night it was on the line. Was he going to measure up? Was he going to perform adequately? Was he going to be worthy of being a Menendez? Or was he going to be found, as he so often was, unworthy? Alan Anderson said at 15 he felt humiliated and rejected and belittled. And how did it feel to a 9-year-old for whom this was his only world? Alan talked about the one-on-one sessions between Lyle and his father. Chairs facing, knees 2 inches apart, extremely tense. And they would last from 5 minutes to an hour. When you did something wrong, you were punished by being sent to your room. And you didn't get out. You didn't get out to eat, and you didn't get out to go to the bathroom. And Alan Anderson talked about going to the bathroom out the window, which Lyle talked about. And he talked about cleaning the room that Lyle and Eric shared and finding a Tupperware container with human feces in them. He talked about how Jose was large and strong and intimidating and frightening, and would pick him up at 15 by the upper arms, grab him by the arms and lift him off the ground and leave bruises. And he saw him do the same thing to the boys. He told you of hearing the sound of the belt from the room and seeing the bruises on the boys. He said he saw it about 12 or 15 times. He heard their cries. He heard Jose raise his voice. And then he heard silence. Jose was more attentive to Lyle, more demanding of him, and more physical with him. He talked about Aunt Kitty, whom he loved. And he described for you, for the first time of many times, the physical posture, the clenching of the teeth, the balling up of the fists, the tightening of the muscles, the rage, the anger, the rage and anger which came from long back in her life. He talked about her sitting there and staring off into space. He talked about her for no reason at all going into this physical posture of rage. He talked about her reaching up in the cabinets and throwing glasses in the sink and then cleaning them up. And most amazingly, he said the boys seemed to think it was normal. It was frightening to him at 15. It was frightening to him as an adult. He was 31 years old when he testified here. And it was frightening for him to remember it. Said the rages lasted from a minute to 5 minutes. Sometimes there was no apparent reason at all for either the rages or the trances. He said Lyle asked him to talk to his dad about discipline. Why is Dad so mean? Why is he so harsh with me? Now, I suppose if Alan Anderson was a liar, and if Lyle Menendez was writing the script, would have had Alan Anderson describing how Lyle talked to him about being molested. But he didn't. That's not what happened. He talked to him about the beatings. He also told you of the rules. One of the major rules in that household is you don't show emotion. You don't cry. And if you cry, You are removed from Jose and Kitty's sight. It is offensive. You are never to cry. And Peter Cano came in and talked about how at age 4, Jose Menendez yelled at Lyle to stop. And Mr. Cano said, Lyle must not have heard, because if he'd heard, he would have stopped. They followed his orders immediately and to the T. But Lyle didn't hear. And Jose Menendez pulled him close and said something to him which no one heard. And Lyle Menendez lost control and wet himself. And Jose Menendez grabbed him by the arm and took him down the hall. And Mr. Cano followed. And Lyle Menendez was hit in the stomach with the fist of Jose Menendez. And he didn't cry. At 4, he didn't cry. And when Peter Cano said, it's not the way to treat a child, Peter Cano was told to leave. And he did. And when Charles Wadlington, the coach, said, that's not the way to treat a child, he was told to leave. And when Bill Curtin said, that's not the way to treat a child, he was fired. And when teachers tried to say, what you're doing is not right, Lyle was pulled out of their class. What was the message to Lyle Menendez about who was there to help him? What happened to the few people who would stand up to his father? They were banished. Kitty Menendez is the only one who ever fought with Jose Menendez. And she appeared to have done it for herself, but not for her children. Alan went on to tell us about the early tennis training. And we have some pictures here of Lyle when he's little and taking lessons. And you can get a sense of the other kids in the class and how small he is. But it began when he was 6, and he was taken to the local park, and he played all day. And they would have breaks for water or tea. I presume the tea was for the parents. And then he'd play some more. And when his shoulder got swollen from hitting the ball so long and so hard, Jose turned it over to Kitty. Didn't stop. Just gave him someone who'd play a little easier with him. And when he got frustrated and upset and threw down the racket, Jose Menendez came over to this little boy and slammed the racket back into his hands, because it took 2 hands to hold the racket at that age, and ordered him to keep playing. Alan told us what happened when Jose wasn't getting the right amount of attention or the right respect in his home. He emptied the Tupperware out of the cupboard, or he dumped the silverware drawer on the floor. Probably doesn't surprise you to know that he wasn't the one that cleaned it up. Alan talked about Kitty's reckless driving, which we heard from a number of people, about how losers were ridiculed, how Lyle's stutter was made fun of. He talked about how when he threw a rock and hit Lyle in the eye and it got swollen, Kitty wanted to cut it with a razor blade. Jose's only response was what the impact would be on his tennis career. Alan told you the story of Eric Menendez being taught to ride a bike by being shoved down a hill screaming. And he'd fall and get hurt, and then he'd be put right back on the bike and shoved down the hill screaming again. And he'd fall and get hurt and cry. And I don't know which is more appalling to me. The fact that Jose Menendez, did this to his son, or that his mother sat there and watched it happen. And when Alan did what any of us would have done, which was to get up and try to comfort this child, she restrained him. She not only didn't help him, she wouldn't let anyone else. And the things that happened to Eric Menendez in front of Lyle Menendez also told him who his parents were, how valuable they were to him, how much their safety would be protected. They also, these things that happened, told Lyle Menendez very clearly what he could expect from his mother. And so he shouldn't have been surprised when in that last week she revealed she knew about Eric's abuse, and her comment was, "No one ever helped me. Why should I help you?" She didn't. She didn't ever help them. He talked about the fact that he thought it was kind of odd that Jose and his sons were showering together, and he thought it was kind of odd that when Jose went into the boys' room, nobody was even allowed to go down the hall. And he described a family with no warmth and no affection. Kathy Simonton was 14 when she went there for 2 months one summer. She talked about the other kids playing in the pool and the Menendez children being drilled to dive and to swim laps. She said it was always tense, but much worse when Jose came home. Kitty would get angry, and again we saw the gesture. And Kathy Simonton, who was 32 when she came in here and testified in front of you, cried when she remembered what Kitty's rage felt like. She said it frightened her then, and it frightens her today. She's a grown woman, she's married, she's got 2 sons of her own, and remembering the rage makes her cry. She said that she felt so badly about herself after only 2 months. She had very low self-esteem. She thought she was worthless. She thought she could do nothing right. And that was for 2 months in this house at 14. Excuse me, as I mentioned, she said the best thing in that house was to be invisible because of the unpredictability of the punishment. She talked about Kitty catching her smoking, which she had every right to be critical of, but she terrorized her over it. And then when she was finished, she delivered her to Jose to terrorize her again as Kitty watched. She described the fact that Lyle got more attention, had more expectations, and the response to his failures was much more severe than anything Eric was subjected to. If he didn't want to play sports, he got punished. If he missed a day, he made it up. So instead of 4 hours in a day, he'd play 8 the next time. She told the same story of the hallway being off limits when Jose went down the hall with Lyle Menendez. And she said when Lyle would come out, he would look sad. He would have a blank, staring look. Kitty was not warm. There were no hugs, except when you did well in sports. No soft voice, no pet names. When Lyle would cry, Jose would say, "Lyle," in a deep voice, and Lyle would stop. Jose called Lyle a sissy because at 8, he was wetting his bed. Eric was stuttering, and Kitty mocked him. She talked about the fast driving, and she talked about a pattern that we hear throughout all of Lyle's life. Lyle took care of his little brother. His little brother was emotional and fragile and frightened and counted on his big brother. From the very beginning, when they were very small and abandoned in airports and malls, to the very end. And Lyle was there for him. He always was there for him. And when we talk about discrimination and judging people differently, I think one of the most interesting aspects of this case is the gender bias. If Eric was Lyle's little sister, would you look at this case differently? When Kathy Simonton talked about the boys and about the rages, she was asked by the prosecution if she felt sorry for Kitty when Kitty was yelled at by Jose. And she said she did. And she felt sorry for Kitty when she went into these unexplainable rages. And she felt sorry for Kitty when she stared off into space inexplicably. And Lyle Menendez felt sorry for his mother. But that didn't make her any more available as a mother, or his world any less frightening. Diane Vandermolen was there for 2 summers and then for a 13-month period of time. And the prosecution asked you why she went back. Well, the first summer, she was treated very well by Kitty Menendez. She told us that when she went to stay at the Menendez family, they were the king and queen in her family. They were the movie stars. They were the rich, successful, powerful members of the family. And they made, or Kitty at least, made Diane feel quite special. She had attention. She came from a family of 5 kids, and someone was paying attention, shopping with her. Kitty was very good to her that summer. And that memory carried her through. She went back another summer, and things were not as good. And then she went back for the stay that ended only when she got pregnant and had to leave. She was an embarrassment. Mrs. Bazanich talked to you specifically about Diane Vandermolen and her credibility and her report of what Lyle Menendez told her. She said that when he was 8 years old, he came down into her room in the basement and asked to sleep down there. And when she said no and started to brush him off, he told her that his dad was touching him down there. And she did what you would expect a 17-year-old to do, which is be confused, be unsure of what to do, and call his mother. And Kitty Menendez brushed it off, made her feel like she must have misunderstood. It couldn't have been right. She couldn't have heard correctly because Kitty Menendez didn't do anything about it, and that was the last she ever heard of it. Now, Mrs. Bazanich has brought to your attention the fact that Diane Vandermolen, who had not seen Lyle and Eric Menendez since 1983, went to visit them 3 times during the 1 week she was here in June of 91. She said she went with her son, she went with his grandmother, she visited in a setting behind glass, talking over the phone with inmates on either side of Lyle and visitors on either side of her. And that he spoke to her on the phone. And based on that proof, you are to believe that she lied. Well, it's hard to imagine given the lack of the close relationship. It is hard to imagine given the access. And it is hard to imagine, having seen Diane Vandermolen testify, that she lied. If she was going to lie, why didn't she tell us she walked in on him? Why didn't she tell us that Lyle complained on a number of occasions? She certainly could have told a far more dramatic and unambiguous story if she was going to lie. And you saw her, and you're going to be the judge of who she was. She talked about the same thing other people did, about the rages, about the staring off in space. She said in public, Kitty could do just fine, which is very consistent with what Dr. Cox told you. He was one of her treating therapists. He said that she had the ability to get it together in a public setting, that she could cry all morning and then go out in the afternoon. She told the same things. Crying was the sign of weakness and you were sent out of sight. She described Jose as humiliating, belittling, cruel, and arrogant, as his teasing as cruel. She talked about the same things, the going to the room, the don't go down the hall, the long periods of privacy with Jose and his sons, the dinner quizzes, the crazy driving, the tennis drill all day with only 10-minute breaks. Then the boys and their dad would take a shower together, and then there would be the history lessons afterwards. She told you about Lyle at 14, going upstairs to take a bath, and his mother coming up to wash his hair and being there for 15 minutes. And Lyle has talked to you about what happened in those periods of time in the bathroom. She told you about Lyle still being involved with his animals at 14. And we certainly know that Lyle was involved with his animals at 18. He sends his girlfriend, Stephanie, a card. And you will see the original of it. which says, I love you, I will always love you. And inside, P.S., this gift is sent to you. And the list of animals. And is so indicative of his self-esteem. He's last. Diane also talked to you about the counseling sessions before going to family gatherings, about what you could talk about and not talk about. She talked about Kitty's drinking and the fact that she was hiding it from Jose because he didn't approve. And she talked about the talks that Diane and Kitty would have, in which Kitty would explain to her how having kids can drive a wedge between you and your husband. She also told you about the advances made by her on her by Lyle Menendez, which was extremely unusual given, first, their age difference, and secondly, how young he was. Jessica Goldsmith was a child when he was a child, and she remembers him as protective, kind, charming, and polite. She talked about how when they chose teams, he always chose her youngest sister, explaining that he really needed that child's help on his team. She told you about being in the shoe store when Eric cut his head, which required stitches, and Kitty finished buying her shoes. She told you about how, for as long as she could remember, Eric and her younger sister were in the same grade. And then one day they weren't. Eric was a year behind. But the most amazing thing is, she was told by Lyle and by Eric, and her mother was told by Kitty that it had always been that way. She tells you probably most dramatically about the situation when Lyle was about 9 and he's hanging from a staircase and he can't get down. And he cries out to his father to help him, to get him down. And his father stands there and punches him in the stomach because he's crying. You have to learn to be a man. And he left him hanging there. And Kitty Menendez was at his side. Faith Goldsmith knew Kitty the longest, and my guess is probably knew her the best. She says, we knew them before they were rich. And she talked about how competitive, how important success was, how important image was. She said that Kitty went back to work right after Lyle was born, and the suggestion was made that maybe Jose was in school and they needed the money, and that wasn't the reason. I mean, a lot of people go back to work, and I'm not even suggesting there's anything wrong with that. But Jose had been working as an accountant for 3 years. She went back to work because that's where she wanted to be. And she went skiing every weekend because that's where she wanted to be. And she talked to Faith about taking her infant son to her mother-in-law for the whole week, permanently. And she would visit him on the way up to the skiing trip on Friday night and on the way back on Sunday night. Kitty Menendez did not want a child, and she demonstrated it in every way you can from the day he was born. She not only didn't show him warmth and didn't show him affection, and didn't show him kindness, and didn't protect him, she rejected him. He lived his life hearing how he had ruined her life. And he believed it and felt badly about it and felt responsible because his mom was so unhappy, so clearly unhappy. And it must have been his fault. She could have been an actress or a hostess in a restaurant, which seemed to have been something that she felt she missed out on. And it was always his fault. Now, if you take a child who is born into that situation with a woman who is totally unavailable as a mother, which I'm going to discuss with you later, and you add on top of that a woman who is possessive and jealous of her husband, and she loses her husband to her son. And I'm not even talking in the sexual sense now. Every minute that Jose Menendez was not working, he was with Lyle Menendez. They were on the tennis court. They were sitting talking about history. He was getting quizzed. He was getting these brainwashing sessions. Jose Menendez was obsessed with his son, and his wife was left to be the chauffeur, to carry out his orders. And she resented this child even more. This child whom she didn't want, whom she repeatedly told she didn't want, now had taken from her what she wanted more than anything in the world, which was the attention of her husband. And there grew between them a very sad and dysfunctional relationship. And Faith was there to see the beginning of it. She talked about Kitty's fearlessness and her courageousness, both in the way she drove, and she told the story about being in the museum when a firebomb is thrown. And everyone is terrified, and everyone runs away except Kitty Menendez, who goes over and picks up the firebomb and throws it back at the person who threw it at, and then berates him. She was brave, and she wasn't afraid of anything. But Faith also talked about the fact that although she didn't fear danger for herself, which was a decision she could make, she also didn't fear danger for her children. She talked about Eric at age 2 being found on the highway, and Eric at age 10 being left in the cemetery by Jose at night, screaming, so that he could be toughened up. Success was everything to Kitty, she said. She talked about the schedule. The boys were up at 5 to play tennis. They had lessons after school. It was unwise for the boys to have friends because they would lose their competitive edge. This might be someone who'd be on the other soccer team or playing tennis against them. And it was very important that there not be any allegiances of friendship there to interfere with that competitive edge. She talked about Kitty's phoniness, how she would speak poorly of Jamie and then hug her and be friendly to her face. She described Kitty as tough, self-confident, powerful, and more competitive than Jose. But she loved her. She was also her friend. But she didn't trust her with her children. She never let any of her children spend time at the Menendez house without her presence. And she said there was, in fact, a point of some discomfort because Kitty would always say, "Why don't you let the girls stay here?" Now, Faith Goldsmith describes herself as a protective mother, probably one of those who wants to know if you've got your sweater and did you eat your breakfast. And she loved and she cared for and she raised 4 girls. She would not trust them for an hour in the Menendez household without her being there. She said that Kitty was very private, except when she had a few drinks, she might reveal something about herself. And she was very competent. If the boys got injured, she cleaned the injury. Not comfort, but cleaned the injury. And the purpose of school was not education, but to make good contacts. You may remember Charles Wadlington, who was the first of the coaches and who cried here remembering what life was like for Eric and Lyle Menendez. He said Jose's philosophy was to train hard, and he pushed them. The boys were never disrespectful, and the drill was that they would practice for 2 hours and run for 2 hours. He described Kitty as sarcastic, hostile, and angry at life. The family was run like a business. There was a written list, and you didn't deviate it. And Kitty enforced the list. He never saw any love or any affection, and he described Jose as the cruelest, harshest person he had ever met. The boys practiced at Christmas, when they were sick, and in the rain. He said they were the worst, overbearing parents he had ever experienced. And by the time he started teaching them, he had already given, he estimated, about 20,000 tennis lessons. He said they criticized and never protected. And he made, I think, one of the most interesting comments. As between the two, he was most critical of Kitty Menendez's behavior because it was constant. Jose Menendez was gone during the week, and however strong and however cruel and however demanding he was at least gone for some of the time. And Kitty Menendez was there every minute of every day, sad, hostile, angry at the world. He said the boys never complained. Jose wanted to live his life through his boys. He saw Jose get in their face and scream at them, and they'd never show any emotion. And he was asked why he stayed. And he said he thought he was the only person they had. Meredith Geisler was the lifeguard who came in and talked about, Kitty Menendez dropping the children off at 10 and picking them up at 7. They'd be there all by themselves. They'd be there in any weather. If it rained, she was the last to pick them up. And the prosecution has suggested to you that because this was a country club they were dropped off at, it's okay. Now, does that mean that if you drop your kids off at the public park and abandon them from 10 until 5 every day, that there's something wrong with that? But if it's a country club, it's okay. I don't think it works that way. She said that she would see Lyle on the tennis court for hours and hours at a time, in the heat and in the humidity. And when Jose was there, she could hear him yelling, hit further, hit stronger, not good shot, nice job. With Eric swimming, she described Jose running up and down the lane, yelling at him. Nobody else there did this. Nobody else cared that much. These were kids. They were swimming. It was fun. But not for Jose and Kitty. It was competition. And competition could only end one way, and that was in victory. She saw Jose lift Eric out of the pool with his thumbs under his shoulders and tell him what he did wrong, even when he won. And Eric never said anything. Steve Mosner was the soccer coach who described Lyle Menendez as a kid who gave 125%. He knew that the one way to make his dad proud of him was to excel, to succeed, to do well at sports. Sports were important to Jose Menendez, so they were important to Lyle. And Steve Mosner said he treated him like a prize racehorse. William Curtin, one of the tennis coaches, said all that Jose talked about were goals and rankings, and Lyle was 10 years old at that time. He described Jose's behavior as being beyond what anybody else ever did in terms of interfering, coming out on the court, interrupting other players when Lyle was playing against him. Never saw him compliment Lyle, never saw affection, found him to be verbally abusive and unfair, knew that he had a tennis schedule which was just totally ridiculous for a 10-year-old child, and described the same thing. If Lyle lost, a few words were spoken, then they would leave quickly. And he said, I just sensed that something was going to happen at home. And if Lyle won, he was told what he did wrong, how he could improve, and he was taken back out on the court. We brought you teachers. And they told you that these were the most overbearing, intimidating, powerful, frightening parents they had ever encountered. And most of them have been teaching for a long time. And they told you something else very significant. Although they all saw it and they all talked about it, they didn't do anything. They knew who these people were. They knew how frightened these children were. And they sent them day after day back into that home. They didn't want to lose their jobs. Alicia Hertz tells, I think, a very poignant story about Lyle coming in and sitting in her office. He's a high school kid. He just sits there. He doesn't speak. She doesn't know what he wants. He seems to just like the comfort of being near somebody. And he does it twice. And then she tells Kitty Menendez, and he never comes back again. She talked about the house, which a lot of people did. Everybody talked about the house the same way. It was disorganized. It was messy. It smelled of the animals. The ferret went to the bathroom all over the place. Now, why is that important? Because she's not a good housekeeper. Lots of people aren't good housekeepers. It is, as her appearance, a sign of her mental state, a sign of the disorganization, a sign of the dysfunctionality. You can be a perfectly functional, wonderful parent in a messy house. There's no question about it. It's when you put it all together. Alicia Hertz described Jose as cruel, abusive, sarcastic, intimidating, and talked about him controlling Kitty through signals. She also described for you her experience of being brought to the Menendez home to be shown a film, which she found offensive because, of its sexually explicit nature and its violence. And that she was offended, and the neighbors were offended, and that Jose seemed to treat it as something to show how provincial they were, as opposed to how sophisticated he was, that they were so narrow-minded about such things. And Lyle Menendez told us he was shown the same movies, that Jose Menendez joked about the fact that the neighbors were offended by this when his own children were permitted to watch it. She talked about being here in August of 1989 and seeing a very bizarre Kitty Menendez. She talked about going to keto. Now, keto is probably one of the least important things over which the most has been made. The significance of keto is that she said she was going there very soon. That was the only point about keto. And she wasn't going there very soon. She was going to Princeton in September to buy furniture for Lyle. She was going to be back here to move Eric into the dorm. She was going to Hawaii with Carlos and Terry Baralt in early October. And her brother has said that there was a trip planned for some months off, winter, maybe next spring, whatever. So, but she'd said it like she was going next week. So that's the beginning and the end of keto. It really is not very monumental. What was important was the totally bizarre nature of her condition at that time. And what else was important, I think, from Alicia Hertz was when she and a number of the other teachers talked about Lyle's relationship with Stacy Feldman. Stacy was his girlfriend from 15 to 18, and they were inseparable. In a school in which it wasn't cool, they held hands and they hugged, and he was tremendously dependent upon her, as she was on him. And he bought her stuffed animals because her parents were going through a divorce. He knew it was a hard time for her, and he thought they might comfort her. This is 15 to 18 we're talking about. He bought her roses. They picked names for their kids. He wanted to marry her. He wanted to create another world for himself. And she was a very important part of that period. And I think she's a very clear demonstration of his need for love, a need which was never satisfied at home. Sandra Sharp told you many of the same things that the other teachers did. They all talked about the same things. Lyle and Eric would get tears in their eyes if they got a bad grade. They seemed to be frightened of failure. The parents were belligerent and nasty and controlling. And Kitty was as frightening as Jose. She wasn't some little battered, meek co-victim. And I think that's important to understand in this family, is that I think the stereotype that we have of the battered family, the abusive family situation, is the husband who comes home, has a few beers, beats up the wife, then goes upstairs with the young daughter. And in that scenario, the mom is usually this kind of loving and sympathetic, but ineffectual woman. She's not strong enough to protect her kids. But, she tells them, it's not you, it's dad. She covers for them. She tries to protect them. But the most important message she gives them is it's not you. You know how your dad is when he drinks. You know how your dad is. He works real hard. And for those children, there is a message. It's not you. It's him. And what was the message here? Even when Lyle writes to his mother in 1986, when he finds that she's written a suicide note and says, Dad's not worth it. Leave him. Come live with us. Eric and I will be with you. We'll be on your side if there's a custody battle. We love you. We'll support you. And she says, it's not between me and your dad. It's you. So she not only didn't come there and say when his dad was being cruel to him, your dad's wrong. She denies it even when dad's being cruel to her. And so the repeated message is, it's you. It's your fault. You're bad. She doesn't cover for him. She does just the opposite. She calls dad at work. He missed practice today. He wouldn't go to soccer. She reports on, and she knows what the consequences of those violations are going to be. And she lies. She reports things that aren't even true. If something went wrong and the blame is going to fall on her, she blames it on the children. And I think Eric Menendez gave you that specific incident in which she forgot his tennis rackets. He goes to play, he loses. What are we going to tell dad? Eric says, well, I don't know. I guess that you forgot the rackets. You forgot the rackets. So this is a woman who not only wouldn't protect, but she would offer up her children. And they knew that. I mean, it's not just a matter of looking at something objectively. They know who this woman is, and they know what they can expect from her. And they know how important their safety is to her. Charlene Elmore, who was the school nurse, talked about the complaints of headaches and stomach aches. Again, there are two interpretations there. One is that he's a kid who doesn't want to go to school, who's just faking to get out of school. And the other is that this is corroborative of the abuse, in which there are physical symptoms of anxiety, such as headache and stomach ache. And again, we have the instruction, if there are two reasonable interpretations, you must by law adopt the interpretation which benefits the defendant. I'm not going to go through all the teachers and all the coaches because they all said pretty much the same thing. But that is the important point. It's not one teacher who didn't like the family or one coach who got fired. It was a great number of people who had the identical experience. Then we had the relatives come in and talk to you. And Marta Cano, who is Jose Menendez's sister, talked to you about what she saw. And Mrs. Bazanich has told you what her opinion is of Marta Cano's credibility. I suggest you can decide that for yourself. She was Jose Menendez's sister, and she loved him. And she was Kitty Menendez's sister-in-law, and she loved her. but she saw things in that home that were important that you knew. She talked about Jose being proud of Lyle when he wouldn't cry when he was hit. And she talked about the same behavior that's described by a number of people, which is when Jose Menendez would talk to his young son, he would look down. We have the picture clearly after a soccer game in which Jose is talking to Lyle and he's looking down and looking sad. And it is a look that is described over and over again. And for me, one of the most amazing things about this picture is, why would you take it? Kitty Menendez supposedly was the one who took most of the pictures in the family. Why would you want to remember a moment like this? And if you took it, and he'd been smiling just the moment before, which is a little hard to believe seeing the photograph, why would you keep it? Why would you ever want to remember a moment like that? Marta talked about Kitty being tense and nervous and staring and not responding to her name. She talked about giving Kitty her Valium in 1985 and about referring her to a therapist back in New Jersey. And she was the first of the witnesses to describe this amazing phenomena of the change in the relationship. For 24 years, Kitty and Jose Menendez had had a relationship, at least around other people, or at least for the last 10 or 15 years at least, in which he controlled her. He demeaned her, he humiliated her, he belittled her. She started a sentence and he said, "Kitty," and she stopped. He raised his hand and she stopped. He didn't care about her feelings. He wouldn't go to dinner parties she wanted to go with. When Lyle talked to her about that, saying, "You know, Mom's home all day. She misses you. You're at work. This block party's important. I think you ought to go." Jose Menendez says, "I don't want to be a part of a relationship where I have to make compromises. I'd rather move on. I'd rather get a new family." That's not what the relationship is all about for me. And in 1980, when Kitty Menendez suspected that her husband had had an affair, she left. Never sure who was left with the children, and that didn't seem to be a concern of hers. She left, and it was up to Terry and Carlos Peralt to try to put them back together again. Because Jose said, "I need somebody to run the house. I need somebody to drive the kids to the tennis lessons, get them to school. I don't want to get a divorce." And why should he? He was already at that time engaged in what was to be an 8-year affair, but he certainly needed somebody home running the house. He said he didn't love Kitty, but he wanted her back. And he told Marzi Eisenberg he didn't love Kitty. But the interesting thing is the change in the relationship. Kitty Menendez finds out that he's had this 8-year affair in 1986, and she becomes despondent. She cries, she's suicidal, she leaves suicide letters. In the fall of 87, she attempts suicide. She is hospitalized for it. She's seeing a therapist. She's incredibly depressed. And Jose is not really paying any particular attention. He'll go to the therapist when the suicide threat is very, very strong. And he'll, it's not here. And he'll pay lip service to it, but he doesn't seem to be really going out of his way to help her out or really concerned about her. And then suddenly there is this change. And he's holding her hand, and he's asking her opinion, and he's letting her throw fits at ticket counters in airports and humiliate him there, something he would never, ever have done before. And why does this relationship change? And I'm going to tell you right now, I don't have a shred of proof for why it changed. But I have a theory, and that's all it is. And I want you to take this argument with that caveat. My theory is that somewhere toward the end of 87, somewhere in there, Kitty Menendez got strong enough to talk about divorce and got strong enough to talk about custody and got strong enough to talk about what she was willing to tell in order to get custody and to get a favorable divorce settlement. Kitty Menendez had a very powerful secret. And Jose Menendez did not want that secret told. Now, there may be another reason why Jose Menendez, after years of abuse and neglect and humiliation, suddenly became this devoted, attentive, loving husband. There may well be another explanation. I have no idea what it could be. Marta Cano talked about the abandonment of the children. She was one of a number of people who went shopping with Kitty at the malls, and the boys would get lost, and the security guards would find them, and Kitty would get paged, and she'd continue shopping. And it happened over and over again. Marta told us about Lyle always looking for his father's approval. She told us about hearing Kitty say she wished the boys were never born, and saw her say it in front of Lyle in 1986. Carlos Baralt tells us that she was saying the same things in 1989 and had been for about 4 years. She didn't like her children. She had never liked Lyle. She talked about the same competitiveness, the same rages, the anger, the hostility. She told you about after the death of her brother and sister-in-law, she, because she was the stockbroker in the family, assumed responsibility for amassing the financial information. And when she talked to the boys about the will, they said, "We're out of the will." And they've told you here. They told Dr. Oziel months and months before they were ever arrested. And Carlos Baralt told you about the conversation he had with Jose Menendez in the early summer of 89, in which he said, "I'm going to take them out of the will, but I've already told them that they are out of the will." So this seems to be something that was known by a number of people, the fact that they were out of the will. And it's a little hard to kill your parents for money if you think you're out of the will. She also talked about the fact that they knew something which other relatives all seem to have known, which was that Jose had not taken the physical for the $5 million insurance policy. He'd had the heart problems in January, and he was scheduled for it. Roger Smith talked about that they kept scheduling him for the physical, and he wouldn't take it. Lyle told you how there was a joke in the household that Jose would tell Kitty, "I'm not going to take the physical. I don't know what you're going to do." She was, after all, threatening to poison the family. But in any event, he never took the physical, and it was something which was discussed fairly often in the family. So there's a $5 million policy which they knew would be in effect in the future, but was not in effect at the time that they were killed.
Yes, let's take our recess. We'll resume at 1:30. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about the case, and we'll resume promptly at 1:30.
Good afternoon. I want to continue going through the witnesses with you, and I hope it's not tedious. A lot of people testified over a long period of time. I'm hoping that by going back and talking about some of the things, you will not only get the overall picture, but it will refresh your recollection as to specific things that people said. A lot of the information that was testified to, it may not have made sense to you at the time where it fit in, why it mattered that Kitty Menendez was competitive, or why what she looked like when she was angry mattered. And so now that you know where it all is supposed to go and how it all fits in, I'm hoping that I will be able to bring back to you some of the words that you heard, I obviously will not be able to recreate some of the emotions that you saw. And I think that that is one of the hallmarks of this trial, is that it was extremely emotional. There were people here who cared deeply and who talked about things that hurt a great deal. And I think in evaluating people's credibility, the depth of their emotion is a factor that you can and should consider. Terry Baralt was Jose Menendez's other sister. Marta Cano was the first one, and Terry Baralt and her husband Carlos Baralt came in here and testified. Mrs. Bazanich indicated she felt that Terry and Carlos were among the most believable of the relatives. And I'd like to remind you of the things that Terry Baralt told us about the Menendez family. They lived near them for 14 years. Of all of the people who testified here, they probably had the most frequent access over the longest period of time. They also expressed as clearly as anybody else, and probably more clearly than most, how deeply they loved Kitty and Jose Menendez, and how deeply they loved Lyle and Eric Menendez. And they were extremely conflicted, I think, in coming in here and being in a position to talk about the things they saw for several reasons. One, because these are things about people they loved. Two, because they are things that happened to people they loved. And three, because these are things they did nothing about at the time, and now in retrospect, judge themselves probably more harshly than they should in terms of what they should have done, what they should have seen, and how they should have acted. But I think that their love and their support for their two nephews is absolutely unequivocal, but not to the degree that they're going to come in and lie for them. They talked about the fact that for 14 years, the families lived near each other, saw each other on a regular basis on family occasions, spent birthdays together. All the children's birthdays were celebrated together, most of the major holidays. They also took vacations with them until the Menendez family got wealthier than the Baralt family, and the Baralt family could no longer afford to go on the same kinds of vacations, so that activity seemed to have ceased. But Terry Baralt talks about her earliest memory of Eric Menendez living in Hinsdale, coming across the street and the lot to her house. And Eric was less than 2 years old at the time. And it wasn't something that happened once. She would see Eric come toddling up to the door. She'd call Kitty, Eric's here. No, he isn't. Go check. She said it happened 12 or 15 times. Now, Eric had to go down a walkway in front of his house, across his front lawn, across a street, across a lot, which she said in the wintertime, or in the spring, I guess it was sometimes muddy. And he would arrive covered with mud, diapers hanging, and knock on her door. And I think that that is a very interesting story for a number of reasons. Number one, I think it was hard for Terry Baralt, and I think it's hard for most of us to imagine having a 2-year-old child that you watch with so little care that he gets out of the house. I also find it very interesting because most 2-year-olds will go to their mother for comfort, for attention, for food in the morning. And Eric Menendez, at 2, had already figured out that his mother was not going to be the source of any of those things, of comfort, of love, of caring, but that Terry Baralt would be. And he went day after day to her house while Kitty Menendez was in her own house, asleep or doing whatever she was. I think it's a rather dramatic story that illustrates a number of points about the dynamics of that family. And it's a story that is told not only by Terry Baralt, but Alan Anderson talks about it. A number of people remember that. And they laugh about it. And one of the things that has struck me about this case is that people use laughter sometimes when they are uncomfortable. They will sometimes describe the most tragic of situations and laugh or make an inappropriate joke. And I think it's our way, our being human beings, our way of dealing with tension or embarrassment or stress. And I don't think anybody really thought that Eric Menendez, leaving his home morning after morning, going across this street and this lot, was really funny. They knew there was something wrong there. And so the story is frequently told with laughter. And I think that that is something that you should keep in mind when you are thinking about the testimony and what you heard. Terry Baralt told us that Lyle was what she called a fast baby. He could stand at 5 months. He could walk at 7 or 8 months. He rode a two-wheeler at 3.5 years. Now, nobody saw how he learned to ride the two-wheeler. We don't know. But at 3.5 years of age, he could ride a two-wheeler without training wheels, which is pretty remarkable. They had his IQ tested when he was 3. This was going to be the super baby. And for better or worse, he had the raw material with which to work. It was nice to be so blessed. But in this family, it set probably goals and expectations which none of us would ever want to have to live with. Terry said that what she heard about the family at family gatherings was always their accomplishments. They were doing really well in school. They were doing great at tennis. They were accomplishing. And these seemed to be the two areas that they talked about, school and sports. It wasn't made the cutest picture, said the funniest thing, did the nicest thing for me. It wasn't the human values that were appreciated and reported on. It was the winning. And even when the winning wasn't there, because image was so important to these people, they lied about it, doing great in school. And they lied about things like Eric's learning disability. And they lied to Terry and Carlos Baralt, who told you one of their own daughters had a learning disability. And they talked about it with Kitty and Jose. And Kitty and Jose never admitted that these flaws could exist. Theirs had to be the perfect picture. She talked about seeing Kitty and Jose fight. She talked about Kitty with closed fists, striking as hard as she could at Jose. She talked about Kitty angry. She talked about the fact that even during the times when he was in public, demeaning or belittling to her, in private, she held her own. She said that Jose and Lyle were the closest, and that Kitty from the beginning had no rapport with Lyle. She seemed to have been closer to Eric, more protective of Eric, whether she was more ready to be a mother by the time he was born or his personality was more suitable to her. I don't know, but everybody reports the same situation. She also talked about the same phenomena that Faith Goldsmith talked about, which was the failing to protect. Lyle Menendez has a scar on his cheek from being bitten by a dog when he was 3 years old. A dog who Terry tells us everyone knew was vicious, and there's no way you should let a child be around that dog. And yet Lyle was exposed to him and bitten. And then they bought the brother of the dog or the cousin of the dog, nobody's ever sure what the relationship was there, for their own pet. The dog who bit him was George, and the dog they took home was Khan, named after Genghis Khan. And that dog was eventually put to sleep because he bit people and was ferocious and was vicious. And that is the dog that Lyle played with as a small child. Now, one of the comments that you will hear in the 1211 tape, the tape that Dr. Oziel made, and a comment that Mrs. Bazanich has brought to your attention already, is a comment in which Lyle is talking about missing his parents. And he says, if I may make a gross analogy, it's like missing your dog. And that is a gross analogy. And that is an inappropriate thing to say. But it is very interesting that he grew up with a dog whom he loved, but was vicious. Probably appropriate for the name Genghis Khan. Terry saw the private talks with Lyle, in which Jose would show up with notes, and Lyle would show up with notes for these father-son talks. She remembers the last one she saw in the spring of '89, when Lyle was 21 years of age, which lasted 3 hours in her own basement. She talked about Lyle at Princeton, living in her house 90% of the time. And Glenn Stevens and Donovan Goudreau talk about Aunt Terry, a member of the family. This does not paint the portrait of a young man who wants independence and freedom from a parental family setting. It is quite the obvious. You saw Terry and Carlos. They're both loving and warm. They have standards. They make demands. But the one thing you never doubt is that you are loved by them. You don't have to earn it. Day by day, tennis match by tennis match, grade by grade. They love you. You may make mistakes. They may not like what you do. They may be critical of you. But it is the unconditional love. And in looking at people's lives who live in abusive situations, one of the things that the experts tell us they look for are how they survived. What are the things that made it so that they didn't break? One is the genetic package they bring with them. Another is if there is any other source of love, of compassion, understanding. And I think that Terry and Carlos Baralt were lifesavers in that regard for Lyle Menendez, because in them, for as much access as they had to him, he found the things that never existed at home. Terry said she wasn't really around him that much as he was growing up in terms of one-on-one time. When he got to college, he sought her out as a 20-year-old, as his brother had as a 2-year-old. Terry told us about the connection that was still there with the family. Jose was calling 1 or 2 times a week. Kitty was calling at 7 o'clock every day, regardless of the fact that it always interrupted dinner. She talked about Lyle spending money. He always spent money. He spent a lot before. He spent more afterwards. And he was very generous. He was always buying things for people. He had a credit card. He had a checking account. She remembers all of those things. She also was there for some of the shopping mall abandonments. Some of the times shopping with Kitty when the page would go out, "Mrs. Menendez, your children are here in the office." And Kitty would continue shopping for a couple of hours while the children sat with the security guard, wondering when she would come back, embarrassed that everybody knew she cared so little. I think one of the things that struck me most about Terry Baralt's testimony is that she was very tense and it was hard and she was saying critical things and she didn't like it. And she was trying very hard to be as honest and as direct. It was very, very stressful to talk about this family the way she was. And when I asked her, how was Kitty with animals? She lit up. She relaxed. She was great. Kitty was wonderful with animals. She was so caring. She was so nurturing. Here was something positive that Terry Baralt could tell us about Kitty Menendez. And she went on with great enthusiasm about how wonderful Kitty was with animals. And I asked her if she ever saw the same warmth, the same compassion, and the same caring toward either of her children. And she shook her head and said no. She said that the kids were trained not to show fear. Give a variety of examples. Eric being home when the storm's going on and calls Terry, and Kitty is very upset that her son would not only need this kind of help, but need it in such a public way as to embarrass her. She talked about her brother Jose. He didn't have to raise his voice for you to know how displeased he was. He had a cut you to shreds tone of voice. She talked about the change in the relationship when they moved to California, the honeymooners. She talked about cleaning out Lyle's dorm room in June of 1989 and finding Donovan Goudreau's license with a bunch of other papers there on the floor. And I would suggest to you that this witness, whom the prosecution suggests you is the most believable of all of them, has directly contradicted one of their witnesses, Glenn Stevens, about the manner in which the license was found, the sinister nature of look what I've got. The license was left there. It was abandoned. It didn't have any meaning for Lyle Menendez. And when it was found by Terry Baralt, she gave it to Lyle, who gave it to his little brother, who was underage, for getting into clubs and for drinking. She talked about Kitty's constant jealousy during the whole length of the marriage. She talked about the fact that Kitty drank. And she remembered Lyle's stuffed animals and how sometimes there wouldn't be any room in the bed for him because he put the animals there and he'd sleep on the floor. She talked about how secretive the family was. And she said, these kids loved their parents, but something went wrong. She was asked by the prosecution, did Jose love his children? And she said, Jose loved his children, but you can love someone and still hurt them. She said that after their deaths, she saw Lyle in a lot of pain. She worried about how he was behaving, the spending the money, the unsettled nature of that time. She told us about the Princeton suspension. And it is the prosecution's theory that part of the reason that all of this happened was because his parents were so upset that Lyle was on disciplinary probation and had been suspended before. And what she said was, Jose was angry at the school, not at Lyle. At least he wasn't a hypocrite. He was the one writing the papers for Lyle. Had Lyle been caught with any of the papers his father had written for him and Marzi Eisenberg had typed for him, Lyle would have been suspended for cheating for that. He just thought that Princeton was foolish to have such ridiculous standards as an honor code. Terry also was well aware of the fact that the Menendez family was buying a brand new, very nice condominium for Lyle Menendez. It was due to close September the 4th, and Kitty Menendez was due to show up that day to buy all new furnishings for it. An interesting thing about that condominium is that it had 2 suites, evidently, 2 master suites, so that there would be room for Kitty and Jose Menendez when they came to Princeton to visit, which they did quite frequently. Kitty's only request was that Terry take a key so she could monitor whether Lyle had his girlfriend Jamie living there, because she certainly didn't want that to happen, which seems to be quite inconsistent with Jamie's testimony that during that summer, Kitty was helping her arrange for Lyle and herself to play at a tennis tournament together in Vermont, and that's why she had the phone card and was using it. She talked about the importance of image and how Kitty lied about the fact that Lyle had been suspended. She always drove too fast, and she knew about the disciplinary problem at Princeton in which Lyle took responsibility for something he didn't do with regard to the pool table. Her husband, Carlos, described the pressure, the importance of winning. He told us the story about not trusting, the jumping from the counter. And he told us how important it was to Jose that Lyle go to Princeton, and that he talked to Jose about the fact this wasn't the right school for him. Whatever other talents he may have had, academics did not appear to be one of them. Every teacher who came here from the Princeton Day School said they were dumbfounded when he got into Princeton. He didn't belong there. He couldn't make it there. He wouldn't survive in that world. And Jose Menendez, in spite of what Carlos told him, in spite of what other people probably made available to him in terms of knowledge, said it had to be Princeton. That's where it was going to be. And Lyle told you he wanted to go to Penn. He thought that would be better for him. He had other ideas. He wanted to go to UCLA. He wanted to be with his brother. But the decision was to go to Princeton. And I think that that is another and one of the more dramatic indications of Jose Menendez's attempt to live his life through his son. He once talked about Lyle being a corrected version of himself.